So I would like to present my best regards to all those who involved in the organization of this conference. And with all the respect to Dr. Hitchcock, I will start my presentation in each theme that I'm been working in the scope of my doctoral thesis. In the 19th century, under the strong impulse of the liberal state with private support, a wide network of establishments was founded, shelters for poor and vulnerable children and for the elderly, mutual and charitable associations, night hostels that promoted reception, overnight accommodation, food and social support for the homeless population of the city, among others. The new forms of mutual help that range from coexist with numerous forms of traditional help, which the misericordias stand out, in the words of Lopes and Paiva, the irreplaceable cornerstones of the Portuguese beneficence. It was necessary to control the social and moral conduct of the underprivileged with the view to maintaining public order, promoting social prophylaxis, and above all, building a model of society regarded as modern and civilized based on the principle of work as a regenerator. In a speech marked by the influence of positivism, whose protagonists were hygienists, doctors, jurists, pedagogues, and philanthropists, many of them with government responsibility, the child's world was being defined by adults with a new sensibility, but under a gaze based on the bourgeois idea of the need to educate, correct, and resocialize, shaping the destinies of the poor and the subaltern. In these ideas and practice that liberalism instituted in the 19th century in Portugal, advocating solutions to solve the social miseries of poverty, vagrancy, and begging that have also opposed to the interests of the population, the good customs, and the public prosperity, whose aim of extinction and repression was at the base of the creation of the Portuguese General Board of Beneficence in April 1835, and of those that had children and young people as privileged protagonists, there is the establishment of education, because it was considered that ignorance of man make man perverse, and that education were in fact the basis of the social edifice. According to Portuguese author Gomes Canutilho, the Constitution of 1822 enshrines the catalogue of individual rights, among which the rights of an economic, cultural, and social nature, of which the articles concerning establishments of public instruction and charity are examples, concerning the teaching of the Portuguese youth of both sexes to read, write, and count, the creation of the new public instruction establishments, to the creation, maintenance, and increase of the House of Mercy. After constitutional ruptures, the September 1838 constitutional text continues the Chartist tradition enshrining social rights. In the 19th century and in the beginning of the 20th century, the economic adversities of the Portuguese family, poverty, precariousness, and misery lead to the abandonment, marginalization, and delinquency, reaching significant proportions. It is the concern with order, since until then the problems that children face and young people caused were scarce, which leads to their insertion in the legal, social, and penal device, and to the creation of specific care and educational establishments, such as the network of public and private institutions of assistance and education, that in the form of shelters and boarding schools for younger people, the normalized behavior and through instruction promoted the ideals of civilization that political and intellectual elites so longed for, and of professional training they oriented towards the future, which was desired to be separated from an indigent and wandering life. After the foundation in Lisbon of the Society of Homes for Vulnerable Children in 1834, and the change in the political ideological paradigm resulting from the decree of Pastor Manuel in 1836, that standardizes the service of the abandoned. Many similar institutions are created through the country, in the continent, in the islands, providing support, elementary education, and moral and civil education to poor children of both sexes, usually between 3 and 7 years old, and the age limits were established by each house. These houses were founded in a particular situation that's in a parallel with the dynamics of Christian philanthropism, favored solidarity gestures around the need to help the impoverished children. They were supported by private subscriptions and was subjected to the supervision of the administrative authorities, as well as it demonstrates the numerous ordinances and decrees published between 1836 and 1908 about their institution, the approval of statutes, and the obligation to render accounts. When we analyze the statutes by which one of these institutions were governed, we found that their proposals were to provide hospitality, that means to provide shelter and cleanliness, to educate and instruct boys and or girls from the most needy classes. The results obtained through the voyant tools, the words education, instruction, cleanliness, and nutrition have a high incidence. Educate meant develop physical and moral faculties, get them used to cleanliness or the obedience, respect, and instruct provides elements of Christian doctrine, read, write, count, as indicated, teach in primary schools of first degree, heading, in the case of the girls, the labor specific to their sex, and from boys from crafts, in a clear demonstration of the importance of making the institutionalized the taste for work, making them useful to themselves and to the society. On the importance of work in the regeneration of man, we recall that already in the 18th century, the Real Casa Pia was founded in Lisbon as a house for the education of orphans and correction of beggars and vagrants by confinement and forced labor, as in other European countries. We recall the fear of social unrest and laws against vagrancy motivated a huge number of workhouses in the UK, which only closed its doors at the 70s of the 20th century. In this collective sensibility around childhood in modernity, the school emerges as an institution that is the structural foundation of change, a civilizing mark, and schooling was a public demand. In Portugal, it is in fact the creation of night schools, libraries, public conferences, free schools for poor children, in what we can call the progressive movement due to the private initiative. School education emerges as an alternative to domestic education, adapting to the atmosphere of the century, promoting progress and social integration. With regard to response given to women, it came mainly from the private, religious, and philanthropic sectors. The entire 18th century was animated, as we know, by debates about education, intensified from the French Revolution by the emergence of the new political and worker subjects, and the need to create equality of conditions, civil equality, and political freedom. The new, more complex and modern democratic society required new forms of action and new forms of responsibility. And School for the Poor are here for this issue, which ensure the very basic literacy to guarantee labor. A broad movement born in England, to which Portugal, like other European countries, was not oblivious, took care to put into practice the theoretical assumptions of literacy, reading, writing, and counting, not forgetting the moral education of the children and of the most disadvantaged. From the idea of free education for poor children, children of working classes, developed by John Pound, a shoemaker, at the dawn of the 19th century in England, which would later be formalized by an aristocrat at the Ragged Schools Union, a union of charity schools, whose aim was to provide elementary education to infant schools also founded in England in the early 19th century, with children aged between 4 and 7 years old as recipients, a private initiative movement that would extend to France, where the first salle d'asile with assistance education proposes opened in 1826, aimed at children of working mothers or those who wished to work outside the home. This movement was also extended to Germany, Prussia, Switzerland, and places particular emphasis on schooling as necessary for a socially and morally prepared child, and so to remove children from a potentially harmful environment, such as the street, and also the nannies themselves, initiating them in moral, physical, and intellectual education under the influence of pioneering pedagogical figures of educational reformers such as Pestalozzi and Froba. In Portugal, popular education is known a defender such as Dom António da Costa, who maintains it as central to the country's development and designates the pedagogical revolution of Castilho as the precursor of the dawns of liberty, of the modern ideas of national education. The cause of progress was under debate, and it was urgent that the new blood be inoculated in the social body. So concluding, protecting children meant fortifying the state. It intervened in the political and social field to resolve the social and moral diseases of society, never forgetting the benefit of economic development. The socio-juridical importance of the child and the investment made in it was established in the belief in a construction of what we can call a new man, suitable for social progress, and in the wealth of nations, being the local school of instruction and instrument of socialization as an alternative to child labor, vices, and bad influences from the streets. Only arriving at the 20th century, the child is a person with rights in Portugal, but only after the establishment of the Republic in 1910, the law of the protection of children was promulgated. And it was an indelible milestone of the promotion of the childhood that combines concerns pertinent to education's hygiene, protection, and correction with a view to preventing the degeneracy of the race. School is understood as an institution of modernity, and the generalization of the population schooling is associated with a broader project of cultural integration that is based on the unifying entity that is the nation state, and represents the whole to include all the population in a given civilization of customs. Here in Portugal, the impulse for more modernization have always came from the private initiative, which is replacing the public authorities. the existence of a multiplicity of childhoods or other childhoods, with the view to lead adoption and protective regulatory measures with a view to preventing the risks to which they were subject, children and young people, but above all, to consolidate the new liberal order, maintaining the social project that was sought to implement. In the ideological framework of the 19th century, poor and vulnerable childhood is often associated with marginality and vagrancy. In the absence of correction, the child could become a petty criminal, leaving society to defend itself from childhood at risk to being corrupted, imposing its re-education through moral training with the end of its insertion in society. States were effectively fundamental and effective actors in replacing charity with notions of civility and citizenship. And in Portugal, as in other countries, we are witnessing a model based on the participation of individuals and or private institutions. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Raquel.
Thank you so much.
Great paper, great way to kick us off this morning. So I'll move swiftly on then and Marjorie, you have a PowerPoint, so do feel free to start that whenever you want, to Dr. Marjorie Gehrhardt at the University of Reading, who is an associate professor there and she's a cultural historian of 20th century France. She's interested in the history of the First World War, visual culture, and the voluntary sector in Europe. And this morning, Marjorie will be talking to us about charity fundraising and the state in France in the First World War. And actually, quite interesting, so from research to teaching as well, so a bit of pedagogy as well and practice, which I'm very much looking forward to hearing about. So over to you, Marjorie.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you as well for the whole organization of this conference. I imagine it's been quite challenging. Can everyone hear me okay? Brilliant. And hopefully you can see my slides. I can see them okay, so I'm assuming that it's the same for everyone. Brilliant. So my paper today focuses on charitable practices in World War I France, and it's based on my research into what is I would say a little studied but yet very significant economically, socially as well aspect of the history of the First World War. So I won't focus specifically on children, but there will be references to the role of children and the mobilization of children through philanthropic practices, and I would be very happy to try and develop some of these points in the Q&A as well. I've been told that I can take slightly more than 15 minutes as there's only two of us speaking. So please bear with me if I get slightly over the 15-minute limit. And what I would like to do in these 15-20 minutes that I've got allocated is to focus first, give an overview really of the evolution of philanthropic practices in France during the First World War, and then move on to looking specifically at fundraising, because I think that's something that when looking at fundraising in times of crisis and wartime especially, but I think some parallels can be drawn as well with what's happening now with fundraising in a different type of crisis. So I'll focus on that aspect specifically, and looking as well how that impacted relationships between charities and the French state. And finally, in a conclusion, I'd like to offer some insights and thoughts on my experience of teaching the history of philanthropy in two of the history modules that I convene here at the University of Reading. And how I came to research philanthropy in the First World War, it was really following on from my work on the rehabilitation of facially disfigured veterans of the First World War, when I was looking into a specific French organization that was founded by disfigured veterans for disfigured veterans, I became really aware of the importance of philanthropic voluntary sector networks in the rehabilitation of veterans. And also they had some very innovative or interesting fundraising methods as well, which is also something that that brought me to want to look at philanthropy more broadly. And if anyone is interested, there are some interesting aspects to do with children, specifically disabled veterans children, and what their organization tried to offer for members' children during the interwar period especially. So happy to take questions on that if anyone wants to find out more. So my paper today is largely based on research I carried out in archives in Western France, in Nantes, Rennes and Tours, and Central France, and also in Eastern France, where I'm from, Épinal more specifically. I have a few more research trips planned, but as you can imagine, with the pandemic, they've been put on hold for quite a while. So I look forward to going back. And it's also based on material from digitized archives, from the French National Library, the library La Contemporaine, and various other national repositories. So it's very much an ongoing project, which I hope to turn into a book, and I would really welcome your feedback and criticism and advice and suggestions for further avenues to look into. So please feel free to ask questions and criticize later on as well. Okay, just before we look at the philanthropic landscape during the First World War itself, I just want to give a few words of context. I don't know how many of you are familiar with French history and the place of the First World War in French history specifically. And what I wanted to highlight at this point is the fact that in collective memory, the First World War was really a time of unity, of national unity, with what was called the Union Sacrée, sacred union. It was this image of everyone, civilians, combatants, different political parties coming together, the whole nation coming together, men, women, children, to support the war effort. And this was largely based on the fact that the war was perceived as a defensive war. France, French soil, French land had been violated. The north and the east of France in part was occupied. So the experience of occupation was actually not just a Second World War experience, but for certain parts of France, it was very much the case in the First World War as well. So this experience of occupation also obviously had an impact on philanthropic practices. The fact that French men were mobilized and conscripted into the army rather than volunteers is also really worth bearing in mind, because that obviously puts more perhaps emphasis on the state's responsibility to cater for them, and to cater for their widows and orphans, and also to cater for disabled veterans after the war, because they were forced into this war. They didn't volunteer. And this is something I have to constantly remind my students of, that they were not volunteers for the vast majority. The participation of the French Empire also obviously had an impact in terms of some charities dedicated to soldiers, to colonial troops being set up, and to colonial workers as well. And finally, I wanted to highlight the really huge cost, human and material cost of the First World War, higher in many respects than the cost of the Second World War, which is partly why the First World War has such a key importance in French history, but also because it's obviously less controversial than the resistance versus collaboration memory of the Second World War. So that's just a little bit of context. And obviously, as a result of the increased needs brought about by the war amongst both soldiers and civilians, the state and private charities had to intervene to try and alleviate some of these sufferings, of these needs that were brought about by the war. So let's say a few words about some of these needs that were identified. And I will largely base this part of my talk on a directory I found that was published in 1916, and that basically lists all of the registered œuvres de guerre, or wartime charities. So these were charities that were registered officially and were allowed to fundraise, to publicly appeal to public generosity. And so I found this book in one of the archives, which has thousands of charities listed. So I've been going through them quite slowly, but the analysis that I'll present today is based, it's preliminary findings based on 550, a sample of 550 charities. And so far, what has emerged is that, unsurprisingly, the range of foci was very broad in terms of who these charities tried to help. from canteens, in train stations where combatants were passing on their way to the front line or back to the front line, to groups set up quite early on to fund memorials to the dead. And I was quite surprised because in my head, war memorials were more of an interwar period, but actually some groups were set up very early on and are listed in the 1916 directory already. We find as well, for example, charities that were setting up workshops to give women women in need, to give them some work, and also charities providing things like portable showers or towels to soldiers so that they could remain as clean as possible when they were near the front line as well. And at this point, I also wanted to point it out, the existence of a number of charities that actually supported soldiers and civilians from other countries, including Serbia and Russian prisoners of war, which shows that there was an international, or at least allied focus as well. So even though it was France was very much targeted or impacted very physically on the French soil, yet there were charities that were slightly looking further afield, not just to support French combatants and French civilians. And secondly, at this point, I wanted to mention as well, in this directory, the existence, the mention of several organizations which were clearly not set up during the war, but had the support, the relief of war-induced issues as their primary or secondary goal, or what happened in quite a few instances, that they redirected their efforts completely from something that was sometimes unrelated to supporting the war effort. And one example of that would be the Syndicat d'Initiative du Forêt, which was set up in 1906. It's based in the Loire area, and they were set up to try and promote tourism to the area. And then at the time of the First World War, as early on as the end of September 1914, they heard that combatants were suffering from the deteriorating weather conditions, and the general secretary of the organization published an appeal in the local newspapers asking for warm clothing. There was an overwhelming response, and for the following 5 years, they would have a number of volunteers at the syndicat's headquarters, receiving donations, teaching local women how to knit or sew or make some of these items of clothing that they need, packing and sorting what had been received, and they even sometimes delivered the parcels themselves. So that's an example of an organization whose work was really strongly influenced and changed quite a lot as a result of the First World War. In terms of the most frequently listed charities, however, in the directory still, I've identified four groups of people who were really a focus of attention. The first is prisoners of war, and in almost every single town that is listed in the directory, it's organized geographically, and in almost every single town, there's at least one charity that is aimed at sending food parcels or clothes to prisoners of war. And in terms of what they sent, from Nantes, for example, a list I found included bread, biscuits, foie gras, sardines, chocolate, tobacco, and cigarette paper. And often there was a departmental organization as well as local groups. And obviously the list cannot tell us how they interacted and whether they collaborated or whether there was competition. But from my analysis of the Syndicat du Forêt I mentioned earlier, there's a suggestion that there was a coordination dimension from these departmental organizations. And obviously as restrictions were brought in terms of how easy it was to send those parcels across and what could be included in them, there was increasingly a hierarchy, if you want, in terms of who could send those parcels and make sure that they arrived. So these different levels, organizations at different levels, I think is quite an interesting element, which I want to look at a little bit more. Refugees, a second group who is very often a focus of attention, a group that is frequently mentioned. Most of the charities focused on French refugees, and sometimes they were clearly identified, their geographical origins were clearly identified, like people coming from the Ardennes area or from the Marne area. But there were also a few charities that helped Belgian refugees. And what's interesting, looking at local archives from some of these places that received quite an influx of refugees, we can see that there was a strong, the local authorities played quite a strong role, but there were also reports of tensions between local people and refugees who had arrived and were perhaps perceived as obviously having a better treatment and receiving more help from both charities and local authorities as well. Wounded combatants are another frequent group that benefited from charitable attention, from hospital visitors and entertainment organized in hospitals. There was a charity, I think, that specifically provided desserts for patients in their local hospital. There were also a number of training schools set up by charities to try and retrain combatants who had become permanently disabled. I've done quite a bit of research on blind veterans especially, and usually it was a case of complementing the work of military medical services that were completely overwhelmed by the needs that had emerged. So there was a strong cooperation there. And it's also interesting to look at, I think, in terms of wounded combatants, to look at the role of charities in terms of, from the point of view of gender relations and masculinity. And many scholars like Anna Carden-Cohen, Jessica Meyer, Wendy Gagan have highlighted the potentially emasculating impact of wounds. But I think when we look at charitable work in supporting them, it shows that there was quite a lot of intervention from female philanthropists, and this could be both reaffirming the masculinity of the wounded combatants, or sometimes challenging their masculinity further, obviously by empowering those women and making them go slightly beyond the perhaps more gender stereotypes that existed at the time. And finally, orphans, which were the last group I wanted to mention, that is comparatively frequently represented in this list I mentioned. And some charities focused both on widows and orphans, but the majority really focused on orphans. Locally listed charities appeared to be often affiliated to a national organization called Orphelinat des Armées, and there was also quite a significant number of faith-based charities helping orphans, and I think that's obviously building on a history, the church history, but that's quite interesting when we look at this particular period of time, because obviously we're after the 1905 law of separation between the French state and the church, and there were actually quite a few tensions between faith-based charities and secular charities trying to help orphans. And obviously here again, there's the role of the state in setting up a special status for war orphans and trying to provide for them as well. So really an abundance of charities supporting these particular groups. And I think the overrepresentation of these four groups in the list is really due to the number of people who were affected. So when we're looking at orphans throughout the war, it's close to 1 million children who became orphaned. But also I think because of these groups all had quite a strong emotional impact on the public. Prisoners of war were reportedly mistreated, children were suddenly left without their parents, wounded and diseased soldiers, displaced populations obviously evoked some of the worst fears of French civilians at the time. And also I think in terms of the representations, the vulnerability, the innocence of children, for example, of orphans and displaced populations raised a righteous indignation towards the enemy, and it could reinforce a patriotic sentiment that the state wanted to foster at the time. And this really helped when it came to fundraising, which is what I would like to move on to now. And fundraising often had a very emotional tone, especially when fundraising for these particular groups of people. So I just want to go through a few key fundraising methods identified in the archives so far. And the first one is the organization of days. I think in England there were flag days as well, quite commonly at the time. In France, these existed as well. So days dedicated to fundraising for a particular group, a particular cause. Here I've included a poster from the Journée Nationale des Orphelins, so fundraising for orphans in 1916. And the other poster, the 1915 one, focuses on fundraising fundraising for poilus, so hairy men, the soldiers, the combatants effectively. And I've included both of them because they really target children and show how children were really mobilized through philanthropy and asked to participate very actively in fundraising efforts, both through collecting money, but also through donating, sacrificing themselves through not buying whatever sweets were available at the time, etc. So these are a few examples. And these national days, I use posters like this in my teaching, and they usually work quite well with students, especially when we compare them to some more recent campaigns, and we can really see that the victimization is unfortunately a theme that is still present sometimes in fundraising campaigns. A few more words about these days, these journées. They were usually decided at national level, and then the organization was left to the towns, and sometimes they were given very little advance warning, 2 weeks or so, which means that they had to delegate the organization of the practical organization to local patrons, and then they mobilized their network of fundraisers. And I think that was really the beginning of almost professional fundraisers and professional organizers whose main role during the war was to organize fundraising from a logistics point of view, especially. And there were so many of these fundraising days. There were sometimes days that were dedicated to a particular area, like les Journées Varoises in the south of France, or Journées de la Marne, fundraising specifically for people who lived in the Marne area, which was very badly affected by the war from very early on in 1914. And what they were selling were tokens like these ones. Sorry about the photos, they were taken in the archives, the very DIY photos, and the one on the left is for Journée Serbe. So again, we see the international dimensions of fundraising for Serbian people here. And often, unfortunately, these little flags or medals didn't sell very well. So there's quite a lot of correspondence about how do we return them? And what do we do with all of these unsold items? But they were tokens more than anything else, really. They were not particularly valuable. And what comes up in the archive as well is this increasing fatigue from organizers and also the public, because there were so many of these days organized. So there was actually a fair amount of criticism going back from local authorities, especially to the préfet at departmental level, for example, saying there's too many of them, people are they're not as successful as they were at the beginning, and we're struggling basically to keep up with the organization altogether. So there's a bit of an overload there. Collections were another method, fundraising method, which was very frequent and building on existing practices, collections at church services, in graveyards around All Saints' Day, in official buildings like post offices and town halls as well. And I think that's something that engaged fewer people, so logistically could be easier to organize, and obviously built on long established practices. And the final method I thought I'd flag up is the organization of performances, like galas, matinees, other performances of that kind, organized to raise money for charities. Here are two programs. You can see that one of them is very, again, DIY, DIY program. And often when they had plays or concerts, they had a very patriotic undertone, but also sometimes a humorous tone, and often the national anthems of various allied countries were performed as well. So again, an international dimension here. Now, when we talk about fundraising, it's important, I think, to also mention how the vast amounts of money that exchanged hands and were donated for the war effort led to abuses and fraud, and that led to increased control and monitoring of charities. The law that was introduced in 1916 required all charities set up either before or during the war, and which had as their main or secondary goal the relief of war-induced issues. They had to register and obtain an official authorization to raise funds, and they also had to comply with a few rules, such as submitting their accounts so that they could be scrutinized, for example. And this was largely because although there was an official status for association, since 1901, although they were allowed to receive their members' subscriptions, they were not technically allowed to appeal to public generosity, so to fundraise on a larger scale. But at the time of the First World War, many of them, seeing the need, just went ahead and organized fundraisers anyway. And technically that was illegal. And in a memorandum, in a circular dated from September 1916 that I found, the author said actually this non-abidance with the 1901 law that regulated associations could have been tolerated considering this very extraordinary times, but malpractices were observed, and this led not only to financial abuses but also to rising suspicions amongst donors, which they were really worried would mean that people would stop giving effectively. So this is why this law was introduced, and it is presented really as a way to protect war victims and also to protect genuine war charities. And in terms of the procedure itself, for a charity to be registered, it involved some investigation as well. So sometimes I found some letters from the local préfet or the departmental préfet asking local officials such as the mayor for information about the morality of the leaders, of the charity officers, to make sure that they were decent people, and obviously they had also to send their financial accounts so that they could be checked and it could be made sure that the money was used for what it was intended. So slightly increasing amount of control and supervision there. So just a few words of conclusion. I'd like to highlight a few thoughts shared by my students on discussing wartime philanthropy in our seminars. And it's often, what comes up quite often is the fact that they thought it was something quite novel and a dimension of the First World War that they were not necessarily aware of. So it's different from obviously military or political, even economic history, but it's obviously touches upon these different areas when we look at state control, when we look at cultural representations, when we look at the role of women, for example. So I think it's quite a good way into different aspects of the war as well. So it's just a topic that they usually flag up as, I have a module on the First World War as a whole, so it's usually a topic that they flag up as something that they particularly enjoyed, which is good. It's also a topic which students have flagged up as being something that encouraged them to engage in independent learning, which is one of our box ticking things. So we want to encourage students to become independent learner and engage in independent research. And I think the reason for that is that there's quite a wealth of primary sources available online through digitized repositories like the ones I mentioned earlier. So it's usually fairly easy for them to find resources, primary sources. However, there's a scarcity of secondary literature, which makes it slightly more complicated in that respect. But that's another aspect that students have flagged up. And finally, I think, and perhaps most importantly, students have often mentioned that studying the implications, the consequences of wartime philanthropy help them better understand modern day philanthropy as well, what was happening today. So looking at some of these posters that I mentioned today, and I think it's integrating philanthropic practices as an object of study encourages a reflection on the respective roles of the state and of the voluntary sector in times of crisis especially, but also perhaps encourages a more analytical approach to the voluntary sector more generally. I'll stop here. I didn't check my watch, so I hope I haven't gone on for too long. I'll stop sharing my screen now. And thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them.
Great, thanks, Marjorie. Really interesting paper. Lots to pull out of that, I suspect. Okay, well, I mean, I think that was very, very successful. 2 excellent papers. Lots of great questions this morning. So if you're okay with that, Marjorie, I think we'll just leave it there. So thank you all very much for coming along to the first session this morning. There are 2 more for those of you who simply can't get enough of welfare, humanitarianism, and social action throughout the day. The next one starts at 12:30 and the one after that at 3. So thank you all again for coming along this morning, and hopefully see some of you later on.